Welcome to this tutorial on writing VBA using AI tools. And in this tutorial, here's what you'll learn. So we're going to begin with preparing the environment for writing VBA in Excel. And then we'll go on to look at getting AI to write macros for you and look at the pros and cons of this process. I'll then show you how to simplify the code created so you restrict AI's tendency to show off and make the results easier to understand. And then we'll look at how you can use AI tools to debug your code, so to solve problems with it, to critique it, so to suggest ways in which you could write better code, more optimal, and how you can use AI tools to refactor your code, which is basically reformatting it and perhaps naming variables and things like that. And finally, I'll show you a full worked example to illustrate all the principles you've learned throughout the rest of the tutorial. But that's enough of looking at me. I'll vanish now, and let's get started. What we're going to begin with is customizing Excel so you can paste in macros you've created in your AI tool. So experienced programmers could definitely skip over this step. The first thing to do, obviously, is to create a workbook. And then what you can do is go into the VBA code editor by pressing Alt F11. There's other ways, but that's by far the easiest. If I keep pressing Alt F11, you can see it toggles me between Excel and the VBA code editor. Within this editor, choose Tools from the menu and choose Options. And make sure the box saying Require Variable Declaration is unticked. The reason is, otherwise it will start inserting extra words at the top of each module you create, and you don't want that to happen. I'm not going to explain at this point in any more detail what those two words mean. So what I can now do is to insert a module, and you can do that by right-clicking anywhere at all within the project. That's the thing in bold type here. I've only got one workbook open, so I've got one project. Choosing Insert and choosing Module. And there's your blank sheet of paper ready to have the code pasted in. There's probably one more thing you need to do, which is to go back into Excel by pressing Alt F11 again. And if you choose to save this, so if you choose File from the menu, choose Save As. And what you need to do is change the workbook extension from Excel Workbook to an Excel Macro-enabled workbook with an XLSM extension. You can then type in your file name. So I'm going to call my test workbook because I have no imagination. And then I can click on Save to save it, in this case in OneDrive, but you might choose to change your location at this point. And now I'm all good to start creating my code in my AI tool. So what I've created is a spreadsheet containing 3 columns: the name of a character from the Big Bang Theory, their gender, and my personal rating on how good I think they are. And you'll find this file in the notes attached to this video on our website. And you could, if you like, go down and assign your own ratings to the actors, assuming you know about the Big Bang Theory, of course. If you don't, you should. What I want to do is to colour in the rows as follows. Any actor whose rating is greater than or equal to 9, which is those 4, should be coloured. And I'm going to use one colour for males and one for females. And while I could do this manually with 7 or 8 rows, if I had 7 or 8,000, it would be much better to write a program to do the same thing. So I'm going to switch over to ChatGPT now. And rather than describing what I've just been explaining, I'm just going to import the workbook. So I'll choose to add a photo or file. I'll choose the file I've just created, and then I can just paste in my prompt. So the attached Excel workbook contains 3 columns giving the name of an actor, their gender, and my rating from 0 to 10 of how good they are. Please write a VBA macro to colour the people whose rating is 9 or higher in one of 2 different colours, and I've gone for non-sexist colours. I've gone for yellow for males and green for females. The macro should colour the character's name, gender, and rating, so I want all 3 cells coloured. It's worth saying just before I run this that I didn't need to give quite as much description as this. My experience is that AI tools will infer from the context and what's going on without you spelling out chapter and verse of how it's constructed. So if I run that now, then within a few seconds, what's happening now is it's using the ChatGPT 5 facility to create a longer answer. I don't think I want one, so I'm just going to skip that and see what it comes up with using the simpler model. And there's my macro. So what I can now do is copy my code, and I can go back to VBA and paste it in. So let's see if this works. Before running it, it's probably a good idea to split your screen in two. So what I can do is click, or rather hover over that little icon at the top right of the screen and choose this top option. So I'm going to get VBA on the left, and I actually want Excel on the right. So I'll just click in my VBA and press Alt F11 and do the same thing again. So it will split the correct two screens. It's really useful when you're debugging to be able to see Excel on the left and your VBA on the right, so you can see what's going on. So let's see if this works. It's crunch time. To do that, you can click anywhere at all within this macro, as long as it's between the first and the last line, and either press this little tiny green play tool or just press the F5 function key. And what that will do is run the macro, and as you might have seen, absolutely nothing had happened. And this is where VBA coding or any coding in AI can break down. If it works, great, but if it doesn't, you're going to need to work out what's going wrong. Now, on this occasion, I'm going to tell you. What it's actually doing is, it says here in the comment, is finding the last used row in column A, assuming the names are in column A, but they're not. And the simplest solution to this is just to cheat. And what I'm going to do is to delete that column and then try again. So now if I click on my macro and I press F5 or click on the play tool, okay, I wasn't expecting that. It's got another bug in. When you have a bug in VBA, a good thing to do is click on the debug button, because it will take you to the offending line. So this is a command which it's falling down over. Now at this point, without showing you a great deal about debugging in VBA, I'm just going to have to tell you the answer. What it's doing is looping from row 2 to the last row. But the problem is row 2 is this one. And it's creating three variables, and one of them is called rating, which is declared as what's called a double. So that means it holds a number. And it's using the gender variable and the rating variable to hold the gender name and the rating. But the problem is on the first line, the rating is a bit of text and not a number. And so its objection is that it can't store the words actor rating in a double variable. How are you to know that without knowing VBA? That's a very good question. Perhaps it makes the point that AI tools are only really good at helping experienced programmers. They're probably not that good at writing code for people who don't know how to program at all. Anyway, let's correct this just to show. I'm going to change that to 3, and if I run this again, I hope it will work perfectly. One final point is worth making on this. Your code, if you run this, may well look different. It probably will do, because of the probabilistic nature of AI generation of code. There are two main problems with the macro in the previous example, apart from the fact it didn't actually work. One is it used very complicated VBA. Some of the constructs are really hard to understand. And the other is it's hard to debug. What do I mean by that? You can click in any macro and press the F8 function key. And as you press F8, it steps you through the lines of code. It misses out these top declaration sections because they're not actually executable code, as it's called. They're just setting aside variable space. But as I press F8, watch what happens to the cursor, the active cell on the left-hand side. It doesn't change. And so it's extremely hard to see what's going on. So we're going to make two changes to this. The first will be to say, just clear those. The first one will be to say we should use simpler VBA. And the second change would be to make the cursor visible, so make the active cell change, which is not necessarily good programming practice, but will make it much easier to see what's going on. So let's try doing both of those two things. What I'm going to do is go back and create a new chat. I'll add in my Excel workbook as I did before, and then I'll paste in a prompt which I have prepared. I'm just going to make this fill the screen so you can read it properly. So I am going to ask you to write a VBA macro in Excel, and this is a generic prompt. I spent quite some time developing it. It's going to be in the list of prompts attached to the video on our website, so it might be a good template for you to use for your own prompts. Although you're an expert in VBA, the person using your macro, that's me, is a beginner. You should therefore write your macro to make it easy to understand for someone who's relatively new to VBA programming, and in particular, and I want to just explain what these are. Class modules are a really complicated thing you can do in VBA. If it does use them, they're really hard to understand. So I'm saying don't use class modules. Don't use for each loops Although they're good programming, they're quite hard to understand for beginners. Don't use object variables or set statements, another thing which it makes for a better VBA program, but not necessarily one which is easier to understand, and don't use something called with clauses. Where you have a choice of chaining commands together to make your code shorter, or doing the same thing using a longer series of separate simple commands, always choose the option with more commands. So what that means is rather than getting 2 or 3 really complicated lines, I might get 20 or 30 shorter ones. And the advantage of that is as I debug it pressing F8, I can step through it line by line more easily. Good macros don't change the current active cell, that's true. A macro will run much quicker if the active cell never changes. But I'm asking ChatGPT to ignore this and select cells before it references or formats them. And likewise, I wanted to select worksheets rather than just referring to them, so my screen is going to be much busier as the active cell keeps changing. And finally, don't include any instructions on how to run the macro, just include the code itself. And don't include any explanation of what it does, but I wanted to include comments within the macro. So this is a prompt which I can use every time and which should create a simple, easy to understand and easy to debug macro. And then I've got the actual macro itself, instructions, which is exactly what it was before. So if I run that, let's see what it gives me this time. I'm going to skip again because I don't really want to get the long instructions as I did before. And it's given me a longer macro. So let's have a look at that in VBA. I'm going to paste that in. So I hope you can see that it's easier to understand. I think it's actually still got the same bug in though. I think that should be row 3, but let's find out. If I now try running this and press the F8 key, can you see the active cell is changing all the time to make it easier to see what's going on? So it's much easier as I step through my macro to see that it's actually doing the correct thing. So that's how you can use ChatGPT or any other AI tool to write simpler, easy to understand VBA code. So to illustrate debugging, you'll find in the list of files attached to this video on our website a file called musicals.xlsm. It contains 5 films. 2 of them are musicals, 3 aren't. And what this macro on the right is meant to do is color the musicals, only it doesn't. It's got 3 bugs in, so let's see what those 3 bugs are. If I press the F8 key to debug it and step through it, it will successfully get to cell A2. This line is meant to say, keep going until the value of the current cell is an empty string, but it's not doing that. It's saying keep going until the value of the cell is a space, and that will never happen, so the macro will run indefinitely, a common problem, an infinite loop. A second problem I've got is when it gets to this line, it's testing whether the value of the cell to the right is musical. But if you hover over the word, you'll see they have different case. And because VBA is a case-sensitive language, that if condition will never be triggered, and no musical will never be coloured red. And finally, a third problem is what it should be doing is going down to the next cell to carry on through the loop, and it's not doing. So what we're going to do is see how well AI, ChatGPT, can find these errors. But to make things a bit spicier and more interesting, all I'm going to do is copy the macro. So ChatGPT will have no context at all to solve this, but my guess is, my hunch is, it will still manage to do it. So in a new chat window, I'm going to paste in that macro, and then at the top say, please debug this macro. I'm not even going to tell it it's in VBA, it can work that out for itself. So after a few seconds thinking about it, it spotted all of my problems. It spotted the fact I've got not an empty string, but a space inside my test there. It's recommended throughout that I stop selecting cells, which is fair enough, but perhaps I should have added a comment saying, please don't make stylistic comments about my macro, just pick out the bugs. And it's saying inside the loop, you never move the active cell down. And towards the bottom, I think, it probably says that I should make it case sensitive so the musical also matches. And then it's come up at the bottom with a shorter but much more complicated macro. As I said, I wish I'd restricted it to just picking out the bugs rather than making stylistic changes. The upshot of that is that an AI tool is going to find your bugs far quicker than you can, even without the context. I use them every single day of my working life when I'm writing systems. Just because a macro works, it doesn't necessarily mean it's perfect. I've got here another version of my Color Musicals macro in the Musicals workbook. If I run that by clicking on the Play tool, you can see it's successfully colored the musicals. But that doesn't mean it's perfect. What you could do is go to an AI tool and paste in a prompt like this. You are an expert VBA programmer. I want you to critique the macro I'll give you below, highlighting any possible problems with it. You should consider any bugs, well there shouldn't be any, things which will make the macro run more slowly. It's going to tell me I shouldn't select cells, I know it is. Things which will make it more likely bugs will be introduced in the future, and things which could be coded better. It's important in VBA to say please don't add error trapping, however, because at the drop of a hat it will add on-error conditions, which just slow up maintenance, in my opinion. Present your answers as a table with the following column headings: possible change and description. I've asked it to keep your descriptions down to a maximum of 30 words each, and to order the changes so the most significant and important come first in the table. And finally finish by showing a revised version of the macro, incorporating all of the changes that you would recommend. And then I've got the actual text of the macro. So this is another useful generic prompt I've included in the list of prompts for the video on our website. Let's try running this and see what it comes up with. It should be fairly quick, I think. But how wrong I was. It took nearly a minute. So here's a focused critique and upgrade plan. That sounds good, doesn't it? So as I suspected, it doesn't like me selecting cells. If you don't select cells, it will definitely speed execution. It makes a massive difference, actually. And then it's coming up with some more complicated changes, some of which are worth making, some of which aren't, I would say. This is a danger. Unless you know VBA, how do you know which of those are actually important? And then finally it comes up with a revised macro at the end, which, while it may be better, is much harder to understand. And personally, I would always favour simplicity with coding. So you should be careful when you're critiquing code like this not to take it too far. So what does refactoring code mean? Well, it's very useful, surprisingly useful given the complicated name. I've got a macro here in the file called filmclubs.xlsm attached to this video on our website. Now, if I run it, you can see it works perfectly. It loops down the list of films, building up dialog box to display, and the films on the list are, and then lists them all out one after the other. But it's not a very pretty thing. Refactoring code involves taking a macro like this and without in any way altering the meaning of it, make it better. And here's some of the sort of things you could include. So I've got a prompt there saying, without changing the function or approach of the following VBA program, please tidy it up. And then I've specifically said some things I wanted to address. So I wanted to remove any variables which aren't being used. Make sure any remaining variables are declared. So you've seen the dim statements at the top of a macro. It's good practice always to declare any variables you're using, and that's what I'm encouraging it to do here. Improve my variable names. Mine were called F1 and F2 and things like that. Give the macro a meaningful name. Mine was called list, which is a truly terrible name. Above all, add sensible spacing and indentation. If you looked at my macro, it was extremely hard to read because I hadn't indented any lines. And make any other formatting and stylistic improvements you think are worth making. And as always, don't add error trapping, otherwise it will do. So there's another useful generic prompt I've included. I hope it's useful. And if I run that with my macro attached at the end, then hopefully you'll see a much better version, although there was quite a long pause between the start and the end of that sentence, I will admit. So you can see it's done things I wanted it to. It's given it a much better name. It's dimensioned my variables at the top. It's added some spacing and indentation. It's so much easier to read. And what I could now do is just copy this code in. Let's try this just to see if it hasn't affected the meaning. It shouldn't have. So back in VBA, if I now paste in my new shiny macro and try running this, and it gives exactly the same answer, but it's far easier to read and maintain. So I thought it might be useful to finish with a worked example of writing a VBA macro to do something slightly more complicated. In the Premier League 2 years.xlsm macro, in the files for this video, there's two worksheets. One lists the teams in the 23-24 Premier League, and the other lists the teams in their following year. What I want to do is highlight promoted and relegated teams. And I'm going to get a macro which I can paste into my nice module over on the right hand side and run, and it will do it for me. So I've got a prompt in the clipboard. And it begins with all the usual stuff I said before about keeping it simple. And then it puts what's called the algorithm. If you can't express the algorithm, you can't say what your macro should achieve. ChatGPT hasn't got a chance of actually creating the actual macro. And often the hardest thing in programming is working out what the algorithm should be. In my case, it's this. This workbook contains a worksheet listing the English Football Premier League teams for 2 seasons. In between the 2 seasons, some teams were relegated and some were promoted. Please write a VBA macro to highlight the relegated teams in red in the first year and the promoted teams in green in the second year. So let's try running that. And after a suitable gap, it comes up with my macro. Let's copy the code in. And if I go back into VBA and paste in my code, quite a long subroutine. So now if I try running this, it's asking me to select the first set of teams. Surely it can work this out for itself. Then it's asking me to select the second set of teams. Again, do I really need to do this? But it has actually come up with the right answer. But it hasn't actually. It's only coloured the first set. And to be honest, I'm not sure I can face trying to decipher that. So although it did half solve the problem, I would then need to decipher this to work out where my bug was occurring. You can never accuse this video of giving a rose-tinted view of AI programming. There's one interesting corollary to this, which is had I been asked to do this myself, I might have done it a completely different way without a macro. In fact, I did. I wrote a previous prompt which just said, this workbook contains a worksheet listing the Football Premier League teams. I explained what I wanted to achieve, and it highlighted the changes for me and presented me with the updated workbook. And if I click on that and then try browsing to it, you can see that after a short period of time, it's successfully highlighted the promoted and demoted teams. And it did it without writing any macros. Actually, that's probably not true. I strongly suspect that behind the scenes it wrote a Python program to do this. It just didn't expose that to me, although there are ways of actually seeing it. So the moral of this is, if this was a one-off job, then I would have been better off doing what I've just shown you. If it was something I wanted to do every day, every week, every month, then I might be better getting my program working instead. There's so much more on our website at wiseowl.co.uk, including blogs, shorter tips, tutorials on SQL and VBA, hundreds of exercises in all sorts of different software applications, and a chance to test your skills in a few selected software applications. In addition to all of that, you can watch our video tutorials like this one in all these different subjects. Or you could consider booking one of our training courses, whether it be classroom, on-site, or online, or even as one-to-one consultancy. Thank you for watching.